Perkins from the Greensboro History Museum, and we are excited to have you guys on board today. Hope you have something delightful to munch on during our show. Today's lunch break is part of a series that we are doing with our colleagues at the Greensboro Public Library, exploring 100 years of the 19th Amendment and looking at some of the unsung suffrage advocates and discussing women as leaders in our community and beyond. And so our subject today is Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown. She was deeply connected to all those areas of women's leadership and advocacy and voting. And so we're really lucky to have here Lacey Wilson, who's the site manager at the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum and State Historic Site, to talk about Dr. Brown and the school she founded, the Palmer Memorial Institute in Eastern Guilford County. Hi, Lacey. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm doing good.
So it's great to have you here, and let's jump right in. Can you tell us a little bit about Charlotte Hawkins Brown and how she came to Guilford County?
Yeah, absolutely. So she was born in Henderson, North Carolina, but moved north at a very young age, grew up mostly in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a little bit around Boston as well, as a student there, and came back down here, was inspired to come back to Sedalia to be a teacher with the AMA organization. But she's an educator, an advocate, a civic advocate, both locally, statewide, and nationally, had her hands in truly a lot of pots that are still very relevant today. But mostly I would describe her as an educator and an advocate.
And how old was she when she came back to North Carolina?
She came back to North Carolina to be a teacher when she was 18 actually, I want to say, because she started Palmer the year after. So she's 19 when she starts Palmer, which is always quite intimidating.
That's incredibly intimidating. So 19 years old, she decides to start this school, Palmer Memorial Institute,
yes.
which is going to evolve into a sort of a nationally respected preparatory school, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, who went to the school?
A lot of people went to this school. I was running through what we know about where our students came from. A lot of North Carolina students, locally Sedalia and Greensboro. Sedalia is where the school is. So a lot of local students, but beyond that as well, we had southern states like Georgia, Virginia, and Maryland and Texas who are going to be sending students here, as far west as Texas and California, as far north as Alaska, Michigan, New York, PA are very highly represented as well. We also have a few international students, Liberia, Nigeria, Puerto Rico, and its interesting status with the United States, sent a couple students here, Bahamas, Trinidad, and Bermuda as well.
And she started the school what year?
1902.
Wow. And she remains the head of that school for a half century, I think.
Basically, yeah. Most of her entire life. She's going to retire in the mid-50s, I want to say, early 50s.
So besides doing all this education work and really kind of founding this new model for teaching, African American high schoolers, she's also, and obviously the school's influence is well beyond Guilford County, like you said. Okay. She's also involved in a lot of other things. Can you talk a little bit about her leadership in the statewide Women's Club Association?
Yeah, she founds that in 1909. She founds the statewide North Carolina Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, which is basically the federation of all the Black women's clubs in North Carolina, helping to connect them to each other, so they can best work with each other on a lot of things. So she's gonna founds that in 1909 and is the president in 1912, doing a lot of things with that organization. I like to highlight the Effland Home for Wayward Girls as she starts over in Orange County, where girls with particular troubles, perhaps criminal backgrounds, or having trouble at home, or orphans, or get the opportunity to be in a space where they can grow and become better through that as well. But a lot of education stuff, a lot of civic advocacy, which will come up later as we talk more about the suffrage things as well. But she founds that organization, participates in it with the the National Council for Negro Women and connecting her to a lot of national organizations similarly as well.
Yeah, and so I think so people can understand sort of the importance of these clubs at the time, right? You know, they're growing up out of this this growth of organization and connection among Black women, especially Black middle class women, right? At this time, you know, they're starting sorority chapters. A lot of the, you know, Divine Nine chapters are starting up. They're starting other kinds of local support organizations. I know when we studied, when we looked at World War One, for example, in Greensboro, when we did our World War One exhibit here at the Greensboro History Museum, you know, they had a Black Women's Red Cross auxiliary. And so, you know, they're finding different ways to organize themselves and to really make change in their communities. You know, what else did these clubs mean sort of for African-American women in the early part of the 20th century?
It's really a space for them to meet like-minded women and people who want to do and make those changes and best figure out how to do so. Perhaps you are interested in getting more involved in local business and helping to support Black businesses in the segregated South, but you don't know how to best do so. You might go to these club meetings and meet women who are otherwise involved in other ways and have other ways for doing so. And coming down from the national level, there might be specific recommendations on the national and statewide as well. Like, these connections are so crucial to helping Black communities in the South advocate for themselves and making sure they can best survive. Like, for sure, in addition, it's just wonderful to have them make those decisions, but they really build the community that becomes Black communities in the South, that further allows them to continue and survive as best they can and pass information along. Like, maybe you would have learned about Palmer from these organizations. Maybe you would have learned about how, what issues you actually could advocate for in these organizations. And that these are things that are not your own only experience. There are Black women along North Carolina and throughout the entire United States dealing with similar stuff. It's really a community, I would say.
Yeah, I think that that's a great way to put it. And I think that just brings us really well into this whole idea of the suffrage movement that's growing, you know, obviously dates back to the middle part of the 19th century, but of course is really picking up steam in the early part of the 20th century. And it's these networks of women, right, that are working together to make change at the state level where they have to once Congress has passed the 19th Amendment. What kind of was Dr. Brown's role in the suffrage movement?
I would place her squarely as an advocate. She is giving speeches all across the United States on a variety of topics, but women's rights is something that she feels is very close to her and very much something that she's advocating on the national and state level. In terms of suffrage specifically, she has, before the 19th Amendment was passed, involved in a lot of interracial organizations where she's meeting with white women's organizations and clubs, where she's able to communicate with them the issues that she and her community are facing and how they could best. Dr. Brown was very much a good person to be doing so because she was deemed respectable in a lot of senses and wasn't determined to be causing as much trouble in the way that a lot of other Black women might have been considered at that time. So she's going to be communicating with these interracial organizations, and then we'll work with the Black organizations as well as the 19th Amendment gets passed to help give them the opportunity to try to register to vote as well. Like, specifically, we know that with her work with the Federation, she's involved with getting literature and education materials out across the state, explaining to Black women how they could register to vote, what it would take, what tests they would maybe need to pass, what the literacy tests were and how they could pass them, and when and where they should go to register and how to get the information out. I think the story that we know a bit more best is in Salisbury, where the information goes out. We can clearly see the civic organization, the Negro Civic Organization in Salisbury was doing a lot. It was interested in suffrage for a while before the 19th Amendment was even passed. So as the information is coming in from the Federation and truly through Dr. Brown quite a bit, They're getting information on what ministers should be promoting how to do this, and how ministers could be involved in talking about women's suffrage to larger crowds. How what club meetings they could be having that could also be talking about voter registration and how they can get that word out as well, in terms of literacy tests and how they could be passed and that kind of thing. And so it was decided on the last 2 Saturdays, there was going to be a storm of Black women going to go and register to vote. And it seems like the registrars at the time were very surprised that this was happening. I think my favorite story in terms of doing a little research before this, was the white Democrat man who ran into a Black woman leading a bunch of Black women to register. Mm-hmm. And he stopped them to ask what was going on and where they were going. She's like, I was coming to register these people to vote. I've registered 119 Black women so far. And his thought was, what Republican paid to have you be able to do this? What I like about that story is it's not even on his view that Black women themselves could have organized themselves to go and vote, and they could have gotten the information on their own. He immediately assumes the other party had paid for this to happen. But you see we don't know exactly how many Black women were registered because of like inaccuracies with voting registration data in North Carolina at the time, but it seemed like a lot of Black women were trying to, and many did succeed. We know in Raleigh, there's quite a few who are voting in the school board election that year as well. It's really quite a lot of just Dr. Brown working in the organizational level to lift other people up, to be able to give them the information for them to make these changes.
It's so interesting. There was a great Smithsonian affiliates program last night with curators from the different Smithsonian museums, and one of the curators was talking really about how voting and suffrage was really part of the Black women's toolkit. You know, it was just sort of one tool in that whole box through which they could affect change in their community and certainly affect change in the bigger society. Because as we know, and as a lot of people have been talking about, as we commemorate the 100th anniversary of suffrage, that there's a lot of interconnections between women's advocacy to vote and maintaining white supremacy, and there's white supremacist arguments used on both sides of both the pro-suffrage and anti-suffrage advocates. So, you know, I think we talked about this yesterday, the episode that comes up in October of 1920 after the passage of the 19th Amendment, while Dr. Brown is working on some of these voter registration efforts. You know, this fictitious Colored Women's Rights Association letter that gets published in the Greensboro Patriot. That's really a scare tactic, right? To drum up this sort of white fear that these Black women, you know, were being steered, like you said, sort of by the Republican Party, mm-hmm. To put together, you know, these nefarious attempts to actually register to vote and take advantage of these amendments that they, you know, had been passed. But, you know, she actually had to disown this letter, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
She disavows it entirely. And when you read the letter and look at her speeches, the language doesn't match mm-hmm. in so many ways as well. But she disavows it because we believe that for her, the school, Palmer, is really just the thing that she's most focused on. Like the civic work, I often describe her as someone who advocates for her students in school, working through Palmer, as well as after with all these civic organizations. If the white Southerners around her believed that she was agitating Black women to vote more than she already was in a very direct way, her school would have been in danger, and mm-hmm. everything that she had built would have been in danger as well. So she disavows it entirely. A lot of her northern patrons will vouch for her in terms of this, and I think I had a quote from her about like she definitely believed like this seems like it was written by a white person trying to make trouble. Mm-hmm. So she's very savvy about all of these issues and knows the position that she's in and knows how she can knows what she needs to do to sort of best keep this position as a sort of well-respected Black woman with this kind of power, but also knows how tenuous that is.
I think savvy was the exact word that was coming to my mind too when I was thinking about it, because I mean, when you think of Dr. Brown, you know, you think of somebody who's just very knowledgeable at connecting with people. And she, you know, she had a lot of white allies at the time, Lula McKeever, a woman at what was then the state normal, and people across the state. And, you know, I think also it's so interesting, you know, you talked about the style, and of course, Dr. Brown's also very well known as sort of advocating this, you know, the style and these manners that, you know, are a way of projecting her own power, I think, into society and into the educational space. I think, I mean, she's.
No, yeah, absolutely agree, because the way etiquette is a big thing being taught at Palmer to these students, for those who don't know that particular part of it. And she's definitely using it as a way of racial uplift. For these Black students to be able to leave this school, know how to present themselves. But it's very much also about like survival in a world and a school and a state surrounded by white supremacy. So in addition to these students knowing how to dress and how to talk and all of these manners and things, they're also being taught how to best present themselves to give them the most success they can possibly get. And she's teaching these two Black students from all over the place, many who were scholarship students and may have not been able to get this kind of opportunity to come to this school, which was not cheap, truly. Many of them would have not gotten the opportunity to get those kinds of lessons. It's really, it's real savvy. I like the word savvy in use of this.
And, you know, and again, she's at the same time, she's not willing to kind of back down or something if, you know, she feels like her position is the correct one. We talked too about how she disagreed with James Dudley, who was the longtime president, very respected at North Carolina A&M College at the time, today's A&T. And in some ways, you know, he was saying, oh, you know, Black women's place isn't in politics, they should refrain. And she wrote to him, right?
Yeah, she wrote to him disagreeing with that statement. She's very conscious of the many layers of the conversation about whether Black men should get the right to vote, Black women should get the right to vote, white women should get the right to vote. It doesn't seem like the removal of just Black men getting the right to vote. It doesn't seem like she believes that that would be the best for anything. Like the more Black people getting the right to vote, the better for anyone else. And thus, and that's not what she directly says to me, but she does call him out in this letter, saying we all need to be working together to get the political power that the right to vote has for us. It's not the only thing that we have at our disposal, but it is a crucial thing. And if women should get the right to vote, that gives us more on our table, another weapon in our arsenal in a real sense. That's not a quote from her, that's just the way I tend to think of it. But she's very much like, no, both. We don't need to separate it out this way, because the more people we have on our side affecting this change, the better it is.
So if you're just coming in to join us, you're tuning into History Lunch Break, and I'm here talking to Lacey Wilson from the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum about Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown. So if you're on Zoom and you have questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A button. If you're watching us on Facebook, you can put something in the chat there, and we hopefully can get to your question that way as well. We do have a couple questions here about Dr. Brown and her background. Barbara wants to know, were Brown's parents educators, and was her early family enslaved?
Her early family was enslaved. Her mother they will flee Henderson essentially a little bit after the Civil War to move to the north with her stepfather. Neither of them, I believe, were educators in the traditional sense, but like she definitely thinks about her time in the north and around Cambridge as really opening up her mind to education and the power that has, and very much advertises Palmer as a northern education space in a Southern space. So that's usually where she pulls it from, but her mother did, and her parents and stepfather did really give her the opportunity to get that education that she then uses on beyond that.
And where was she educated in Massachusetts?
She was educated in Cambridge. I'm trying to remember the school that she went to specifically off the top of my head.
Okay.
It's not coming to my mind, but I know our website is very highly developed. We've got this great digital resources tab that I was going to promote later on this as well. So feel free to explore resources there, because that's one of the facts that's not staying right now.
You know, it's hard to know so much because she was a woman of so many talents and so much experience. And Palmer, of course, was a boarding school in Sedalia, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have the remnants of the 2 dorms. The visitor center where I am right now is on the boys' side of campus. When you take a campus tour, we'll walk you over to the girls' side where you see a much larger dorm. That's not a preference between the boys and the girls. It's just that when the boys' dorm was being built, the Great Depression had hit, so it ended up being about 2/3 the size of the girls' dorm.
Another fact of history, right? Coming in. So, you know, I think so. Dr. Brown's so fascinating, but again, you're working at a historic site there that tells her story, and so let's talk a little bit about the site as well. You know, just tell us a little about it.
Sure. So we are at the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum, the State Historic Site. We are the leftover space. Leftover is not the greatest word, but this is the Paul Memorial Institute that ended up closing about 1971. So if you come here, and we encourage you to, we're still doing campus tours, outdoors, socially distant, masks on. You can still come and hear all this amazing history, and we are excited to tell you about it. But we'll explore the outdoor spaces, talk about the buildings and the stories of the school being built, what the students would have learned, where these buildings were, and what they meant, and what it cost to get them. Like the amount of fundraising that Dr. Brown does throughout her tenure here in the space is astounding in order to get the money to build these buildings, to get these students here, to get them what they need, as well as keep it going. It's about a 40-acre space. The students also had a farm here on this space, doing agricultural work, we were learning mechanical skills, a lot of liberal arts on the space as well, and a lot of huge library, and the auditorium was where they had the chapel as well. But please come by and see it. We'd love to have you. But as I mentioned with the digital tab, if you're not as close to us as at the moment, we are in Sedalia, a little bit outside of Greensboro. We do have our digital resources tab. We have an amazing 360 tour of Canary Cottage that went up about a week ago, which we really want to encourage you to see. Since we're not taking people into the buildings right now, that's a great way for you to see the inside of Canary Cottage in a really close up and exciting way. We also have a campus tour on there as well, done by a very talented UNCG Museum Studies grad of this past summer. So please go and look at the work of Casey as well.
Yeah, great. And we should add that you're, pretty new here, not necessarily new to Greensboro area and Gilbert County, but you're just recently taken on this role of site manager at Charlotte Hawkins Brown. And you and I are both graduates, proud graduates of the master's program at UNC Greensboro. Tell us a little bit about what you've been doing since you graduated. And
sure, I graduated in 2018 from UNCG, the wonderful museum studies program. If people are looking for a great museum studies program right now, and I had promptly gotten a job in Savannah, Georgia, to be a historic interpreter at the Owens Thomas House and Slave Quarters. At the time, we were bringing groups of people through the house talking about urban slavery, antebellum politics, and the sort of nuances of all of that with the house of the Owens Thomas House and Slave Quarters. Really just delving into the nuances. Yes, it's a very beautiful room, but let's talk about who would have had to set it up and what their lives were like and why they were different from those who were actually getting served in the space. That whole dynamic in those difficult, nuanced, and complicated conversations. I was doing that for a little, about almost 2 years. And then I had gotten the opportunity to get this position and come back to Greensboro. And my coworkers, Leslie and Sonia, are also from the UNCG Museum Studies program. And I was happy to join them here and telling this very exciting story.
And do you think your work sort of in some of that interpretation of enslaved life and other things, I mean, how does that going to inform what the story you're telling and at Charlotte Hawkins Brown, do you feel?
I think it informs a lot of it because they're both stories in terms of history that are very tied to race, very tied to Southern history, and bringing out the stories that people might not have known when they actually visit the space. People visit Greensboro, they may not know, they come maybe for the International Civil Rights Museum, for that story. They may not know that a bit down the street, before the traditional civil rights movement, there's civil rights work still being done in this space. There are Black students getting educated, and many of them will go on to college afterwards. Over 2,000 students graduated from this institution and are still alive today. Our alumni are so very vocal, but it's kind of a hidden gem in terms of the stories that we get to tell here. And they're nuanced stories in terms of being able to educate and the kind of civil rights work that was being done here, as opposed to when people automatically think about civil rights work. So I would say similarly, when people think about slavery, they don't often think about urban enslavement. They think about plantations. They think about the movies that they've seen, and they don't often show the urban environments and what that meant, much less the connection to the antebellum politics as well, which I focused heavily on in talking about those stories.
Yeah, and the story of education is so important to our county in so many ways, and the history of this region, and not just Guilford County, but all the way over to Salem. And I think that your site is really another great piece of that story, where you're talking about race and gender and education and some of these slow changes that we see happening around as well. It's wonderful. So one of our viewers wants to know about education and sort of how many boarding schools were there for African-American students within the South or the country. Do you know a little bit more about that, or talk about that in the context of Palmer?
So in the context of what we've been talking about, I was trying to figure out a way to bring this in anyway. Charlotte Hawkins Brown was known as a member of the 3 Bs. Most famously, more than likely known, is Mary McLeod Bethune in Florida, who also was doing a lot of education work and was also doing a lot of civic advocacy in that same sense, advocating for Black women's right to vote in a lot of senses. And then up in DC, Nancy Burroughs as well. So those are also doing a lot of education, doing a lot of political advocacy as well. One of the pictures that you may have seen on the PowerPoint is the 3 of them. It's from a newsprint, so it's not the greatest quality, but it is all 3 of them. And they communicated through letters and at meetings and at conferences, and relatively similar situations in terms of running a school as Black women, and also very involved in political advocacy, advocating for the students as well as beyond that as well. Now, Charlotte is involved primarily, it has a lot more Northern supporters, I would say, than the other 2. And thus, you see, we have to talk about her and her civil rights work in a bit more of a nuanced way, acknowledging that as well. But those are the 2 that come off the top of my head a bit more to mind. But it is still a segregated South. And this is not a public school. It's a boarding school. It's a preparatory institute. It costs money. We had quite a few scholarship students here as well. And students would consistently work on the site as well to gain the money. But being able to have the resources to have a boarding school, a preparatory school at the time, were out of reach for quite a few Black people at the time.
And did the teachers, the educators who worked at the school come locally, or did Dr. Brown recruit them from farther away?
Both, I believe. I know she's getting a lot from HBCUs as well, but that's a project that we are ongoing in terms of tracking exactly where she's getting a lot of these teachers. I know there's quite a few that were students here at one point and that will grow up and then become teachers here later on. We have a few notable examples of those, but it's pretty wide reaching in terms of that, because she's going out and giving these speeches about her school, about education, about women's rights, about all of these things. And she truly gives speeches about a ton of things. It would be unsurprising to me that she would be then inspiring a future teacher to want to come to Sedalia and seeking to be teaching here.
Mm-hmm. So another one of our questions it involves Brown's writings or her views on segregation of school, and whether she was in favor of desegregating schools or sort of this idea of social equality that in terms of separate facilities versus, I guess, integrated facilities. And she's sort of, I guess, be seeing a little bit of this, certainly by the time we get to the mid part of the century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of happening around her, but it's an interesting thing in terms of all of that, because that's a difficult conversation that we talked about with a lot of the communities before the end of segregation. Mm-hmm. With what were these the best, was this the best place for those communities, or perhaps should immigration not have happened in a lot of senses? I think it's a historical question that keeps coming up. When we look at the work of Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown, she's involved with a lot of interracial cooperation organizations. She is interacting with white women in these organizations, talking about how they could best help each other, how they could best work with each other. And we have to remember how precarious that situation is, as well as that she had the resources and the respectability to be able to be in those rooms and have those conversations. I don't think we have anything on the record for her definitely saying we shouldn't integrate. Mm-hmm. I think we more see in her actions that this would be the thing that that would be the best overall in terms of other educators, because as it took a while for Greensboro, for there to be a Greensboro public schools for Black students in the area, to my understanding. And thus, this was really one of the only options for a lot of people, and it's unaffordable to a lot of people mm-hmm. as well. So being able to have more opportunities, I think, is probably where her line of thinking would have gone. But it's hard to, she doesn't come down off the top of my head one way or the other.
I feel like we could just talk about her for hours, but we're almost out of time. Tell me real quick sort of what's happened at the site. You've mentioned that there are tours available right now, socially distanced tours, and you're out for the campus outside.
Absolutely. Please come get a tour from us. We are excited to give you a tour, giving our time which we are closed. Our tours are at 10, 1, and 3, Tuesday through Saturday. If you'd like a guided tour, those are the times 10, 1, and 3. You can come for a self-guided tour and just explore on your own. We have a cool digital map that you can get a little code from on the front of our door, and a map, and just explore on your own. You are free to do that from about 10 to 5 as well. And our digital resources tab on our website has digital tours as well that we encourage you to check out. Just yesterday, we took over the First Lady's social media. So if you have like or follow Mrs. Cooper on social media, Facebook or Instagram, you will see some of our posts, you'll see some of our information, and we will encourage you to check those out. I did a mini digital tour of Canary Cottage yesterday that got a lot of traction and seemed to be enjoyed. And if you're looking forward to the Folk Festival coming up that normally happens in Greensboro, you will see a performance on our site that will occur, I believe, in September and be out. But we really just encourage you to come here and let us tell you about the history, because we're excited to do so.
That's going to be exciting. Can't wait to see the Folk Festival performance. I know all those performances this year are going to be online, but they're doing them in these wonderful locations all across Greensboro, and obviously into other parts of Guilford County, though, all the way over in Sedalia. So that's fantastic. And of course, follow these guys. They on your social media. They've got tons of great information about their site, about North Carolina history and education. Thanks again, Lacey, and everybody. I hope you guys have a good lunch. and we'll see you again soon.